Okay, so the next session, we've heard quite a lot this morning about various schemes around the world. Andrew talked about the bank-led schemes in the Nordics and the Singapore scheme and obviously EIDAS and so on. And it was also interesting to hear Michael talking about the fact that identity is actually less important than identity management and sort of how we organise the uploading and importing of our identity credentials and how we authenticate against them. So this is a very important topic, and Andrew kind of bigged up Kaliya, so you've got a lot to live up to here, Kaliya. But anyway, Kaliya is from Identity Woman, and she's going to be leading this panel session, so I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here with all of you, and we just heard a lot about personal data, and this panel is focusing on identity and understanding identity management schemes around the world and sort of practical applications and how it works. So I'm going to start off by asking each of the panelists to say a little bit about themselves and also to answer the question, what is identity? So let's start off with Marie on the far side.
Yeah, nice to be here. My name is Marie Austenaa. I'm from Visa, heading up digital identity. So what do I think it's about digital identity? I look at it from, now I come from the payment industry, regulated and security and so forth. So I will have, one definition that may be different to some of the others here. I'm also looking across Europe, so not just in the UK, but have a perspective around the European market as well. So in that setting, for me, identity is really, it's about who I am, really, truly who I am. It's about the ability to prove that I have an intention that I want to do. I want to authenticate something. I want to agree to something, legally binding. So I look at my identity, a strong authentication, and a legally binding electronic signature. That's my very broad definition of identity. And it's, again, something I can use again and again. So something is reusable. Okay, but then I need to switch this off, right?
Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, sorry about that. Is it okay? Did you probably got the messages?
Hopefully. So I'd also like to separate out, I think there's this question of what is identity and what is digital identity. So do you distinguish between the two?
Ideally, your digital identity is is a representation of your true identity that you have in the real world. But of course, it doesn't have to be everything about you.
Right.
It can be certain aspects of you. But the point is as well is that you are in control and you can share what's necessary in that particular use case for that particular purpose, of course, with great user experience, security, and regulatory compliance. So it can mean many different things, I think.
Thank you. Andy.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm Andy Milton. I'm from Hitachi. I look after or work in the security business group, which specifically focuses on biometrics and finger vein biometrics. So looking at the veins within your finger to uniquely identify you as a person. So for me, and for what we do, we're very much focused around physical attributes to identify you and using those in the digital world to prove that you're the physical being. I think Harrison just talked about the example of 2 John Smiths. Actually, there could be 5 million John Smiths in the world, but actually none of those John Smiths will have the same biometrics if the biometric is of the right standard and delivers the right standard of identity and is verifiable through that process.
Simon.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me okay? Yeah, great. So I'm Simon Binns, Chief Commercial Officer of FinGo. And I am a psychology graduate from many, many years ago. And we used to debate identity a lot from a psychological point of view. What are the foundations of identity? What builds identity? So it's quite interesting 30 years later to be sitting in a room talking about digital identity, which was something that wasn't debated on my degree course. Bring it slightly more on topic. Just a bit of an intro. We work with Hitachi and we've developed an identity platform that enables people to join a scheme and identify themselves just with themselves. So no card, no device needed, no PIN needed. This is a scan of the finger vein ID. And our ethos, having started in a kind of music festival environment, was putting the user in complete control. So that the nexus that Michael was talking about earlier about the individual, the corporate and the state is really interesting. We started with the individual and saying that the philosophy of the business is identity for good. So what is it? The users in control, where should they be using their identity and how should they be presenting themselves without the need for kind of intermediary devices? So our notion of digital identity, without the theoretical, but our kind of practical notion is you're in control of the data you provide us and where you want to connect. And you can be anonymous if you want to get through a gate because of the permissions. So it's about the fundamentals of user control and freedom. And our solution is completely free to use and open access. So we're dealing with issues of financial inclusion and digital inclusion in some parts of the world. One a really interesting case study we're doing at the moment is in Australia, in the Outback remote community, working with a group there called Outback Stores. They have huge challenges of getting cash and payment cards to those individuals. So our solution is, well, actually, if we enable the user to transact with their identity, a representation of their identity, their own finger vein pattern, then we can use those existing rails, but literally put the identity in the hands of the users. So we're very much individual user control based, and we're trying to strip back the layers that are allowed without compromising security by working with Hitachi for the fundamental kind of efficacy of the vein modality in the first place.
Thank you. So I'm Kaliya, and my handle is Identity Woman. So people ask me all the time what identity is. And my first answer is that it's socially constructed and contextual. It sort of gets back to where you start out with psychology. But we as humans this is echoing. Does it need to get closer?
No, you good?
I'm good, okay. We as humans throughout time and history are defining who we are in social contexts that change. And it's really important that we not lose sight of that when we start to move towards the digital. One of my concerns is that in the digital world where everything's anchored to identifiers, and potentially the identifiers that are on your national or state level ID, is that all the things you do in all contexts can get linked together in ways you don't want. Whereas if we move around in the physical world, before we had digital identity, 100 years ago, we separated different parts of our lives by moving to different contexts, even though we had the same body and potentially were using the same name. Where we went and worshiped religiously wasn't necessarily observable and tied to where we go to work or where our kids go play sports and all these things. So through my lens focusing on user-centric identity, always come back to how do we support people managing their context in a way that they want to, and not just having everything aggregated all together behind the scenes without their awareness or consent. So why is digital identity particularly important now? And I'll start with you, Marie.
I think it's important in many different areas, but of course from my perspective it's about fraud, it's about certainty, but it's also about innovation. And my context, payment innovation around how you make payment, who the different payers are, how convenient, how easy and how securely it is. And we see that in countries that has an existing reusable identity scheme, there are more opportunities for innovation. There's easier to get services in place that you can do things like, as a biller, you can request payment, or you can make payment to your peers because they're already identified. And it's easier to onboard as well onto new digital services because the onboarding process is biometrics, and you know exactly who you are. So I think in that area, when it comes to innovation, when it comes to digitalization of government services as well, this is essential. But it has to be an identity that you can trust. So it has to be certain certainties around certain levels of assurance around how it was proven. But I think there's another topic we can pick up as well is what happens when these two worlds collide or meet. The world about authentication based on attributes with the true identity based on really your basically your passport at the end of the day, your identity card. What happens then, like what you were saying as well, in terms of being in control, what type of information is being shared, is now too many things known about me. But where I see the important use cases as of today, it's really around innovation.
Right. And in terms of countries that have, what are the countries that you see that have the most widely deployed EID schemes, and which countries do you wish had them that haven't got there yet?
Yes, of course, I'm just looking at Europe from that perspective. I think everybody wished that the US had a great identity scheme that was privacy preserving and regulatory compliant and fantastic user experience and super secure, but we're not there today. But that's on my wish list. But of course, and I am biased, looking at the Nordics, there are identity schemes there that work really well. So when we are looking at now, new payment rails, new ways of making payments as well, the Nordics is far ahead, and it's so easy to come up with new services there because that 80-90% plus of the addressable market or the population above a certain age will have an identity scheme. They know exactly how to use it as well. I see Belgium with EMEA. I think there's now more than, if I'm not mistaken, there's like 80% now of the population using it, and significant growth during the pandemic because it is so easy to use and it solves so many problems that you have. These markets are very mature, and there's a kind of collaboration across banks that has made it possible. There's a regulatory environment as well. But I think then it's useful to look towards what's happening in the EU regarding EIDAS, the Next Generation Identity Trust Service Framework, as well as in the UK. And there's a future, I think, that looks quite similar for other countries as well. But we can elaborate on that later.
Maybe I can pick up on one of the things you said about the US and the hopes that it improve. I'm very optimistic about the emerging decentralized identity tools that are coming aboard. And this calendar year, US CIS is going to be issuing digital green cards using the verifiable credential format. So that's not everybody, but there are millions and millions of green card holders in the US, and it's a significant early trial of this technology at scale in the US population. So I'm crossing my fingers that we'll see that technology succeed where sort of these more sort of centralized authentication back to the state systems that are acceptable in Europe would never fly in the United States we can still solve that identity problem. So one of the key aspects of identity is this difference between, or these stages in the life cycle. There's the stage of enrollment where you acquire for the first time a digital identifier, usually given to you by an entity, whether it's a state or a business, and then you use it. So can you talk specifically, Simon, about your processes that you have for enrollment, and then the difference between the enrollment and then the usage of digital identity?
Sure. So, in fact, I've just been on a call with the UK Home Office as we're taking part in an age verification regulatory sandbox. So the output of that and our trial will be using FinGo to both pay and prove age simultaneously, addressing issues in hospitality, retail, and unattended. So to enable that, we kind of upgraded our onboarding process to include create the account and an ID document, driving license or passport that's verified and checked, versus the individual, and there's various other checks that go on. And then at the point that you have, we talked about one-time codes earlier, you enter a one-time passcode at a physical FinGo kiosk and enroll your biometric, linking yourself to the profile you've created. And at that point, you're then able to pay, to prove age, or to get access and into multiple services. So that's literally our process. And the applications are using some of the payment rails, but in terms of the transaction processing, but making that simultaneous transaction also be a richer transaction in terms of data. So it's demonstrating the individual's age and payment. So in a real world example, a bartender doesn't need to challenge and ask for ID. because of the nature of the onboarding process, I'm doing transactions simultaneously. So adding, it's a higher value, richer transaction based on the onboarding process that we've created. So that's a pretty direct answer to the question, actually.
Yeah.
The other point, I was going to jump in earlier around identity and where it's at. The start points across the world are so diverse. There's so many multi-speed levels. You've got the US. We did work in Denmark with NemID, and that's vastly ahead. We're also working with projects in the Middle East, particularly Egypt, where it's still physical documents going into 4,500 post offices around the country, and there's 100 million population. So they've experimented with other forms of digital identity, but they're still reliant on very, very old school paperwork, and many markets in the world are like that. So the notion of digital identity is incredibly diverse in application, with obviously Scandinavia leading the way, but I think probably most of the world by population is still way behind.
Yeah.
So they're looking for solutions that enable that convenience and security and ease of use, bearing in mind the notions of digital and financial exclusion, and trying to find the simpler ways of deploying. So I'll jump from onboarding to another point, but that's the onboarding process.
Do you have something to share about onboarding and authentication, Andy?
Yeah, I think for us, one of the strengths of what we're trying to do with onboarding people is particularly around not having only one finger. So we have multiple fingers. That way gives us more variations of enrolling people, gives us more way of capturing that single identity. Whereas what we've seen with some other modes of biometrics is you only have one of something. And actually we have to be, the user is complicit with us in wanting to join in and wanting to take part in our process, rather than potentially it's on display and it's available all the time. We've also Mission Impossible, where you leave your fingerprints on a glass. And that type of move to the user actually being complicit in providing it seems to give confidence to the users.
Right.
And we've seen that especially when we've done some projects in developing nations and places where they're even sort of a little bit fearful of technology and cameras and other things, that putting their finger in a place is much less dramatic for them.
So can you, I looked on the website and I was like, oh, that's what it looks like. Can you describe the device for folks and just briefly how it works? Because we're waving our hands a little here.
Yeah, so we have a few different devices. We have one that has some lights, some LED lights above it. You place your finger, it shines a light through, it highlights the vein pattern within, which is predominantly what we use with Simon. We have a device we use for Barclays, which shines light from the side, and that's much smaller and much more mobile. And we're using that with all the corporate payments that Barclays do to speed that up, make it easier, not have so many tokens and passwords sent around. And then we also have a new device which you use 3 fingers at once and shines the light from underneath. But again, captures a vein pattern, and we can also use a laptop camera, and you just hold your hand up to a laptop camera, and we can also capture your vein pattern that way. And soon we will also be doing that on mobile as well. We're in testing at the moment.
Interesting.
So, but we're specifically looking for the vein pattern, and that is unique in most people from the age of about 10 to 12 and remains consistent through their life. And we have much less problems than fingerprint or other things with damage and other issues.
Interesting. And when I started in digital identity 20 years ago, I was completely freaked out by my biometrics, and I've learned a lot about them over the years, and actually run a conference called the Thoughtful Biometrics Workshop to really create space for engagement between those who are freaked out by them and those who are actively using them. And one of the things I like about vein, whether it's palm vein or I didn't even know you could do finger vein, but is that it's inside the body and you don't leave it behind and you can't photograph it, right? And so it has pretty good qualities for an authentication factor that isn't stealable. So
Just to comment on sort of user adoption of biometrics,
Yeah.
and because we've had FinGo in many parts of the world and many trade shows, and we've also done some research in the UK looking at how would you prefer, and then this was payment related, doing the project with Visa Collab some time ago. How would you prefer to pay? Cash, card, Apple Pay, or FinGo? And actually, once you explain what it is that you create the account, as I've done, you just scan the finger. The driver for biometrics is always convenience. Once you demonstrate the utility and convenience, people will adopt it with a level of the freak out bit is I need to know what it is and that it's not,
Right.
too scary. But the driver is always, if you can combine convenience and security, then you get over any adoption barriers you're going to have initially because of unfamiliarity, basically. So it's an education job.
Well, and it's different than some payment schemes that use face to pay. As soon as I enroll my face in some system and attach my name to it, I'm potentially, we don't know, not all actors who do that are good, that those faces can all end up being in a database, and I can lose potentially my default anonymity in everyday life because now my face and these things. But you can't get my vein from walking down the street.
Face is typically match on device, so you're not necessarily providing it to a central database. So, but there are concerns of crossover from security and police usage versus individuals, but the face is generally match on device. We use elements of face in our onboarding process, but it is fundamentally around convenience that drives it, and utility. And face, for various reasons, face doesn't work as well when you have a scheme of many users and you're doing a one-to-many match within 2 seconds. It's just about utility and some ambient light conditions impacts as well. But
Cool.
but there's a level of understanding in the population around what biometrics are and what they're used for, and versus starting with fingerprint and detective stories from the 60s and 70s to where we are is quite broad. So there's a big education job we always find.
Yeah. I think for me that's always the biggest challenge is trying to help people understand biometrics and the fact that it's enabling technology and it's not anything more than that. And also I think there's challenges we have with lots of the programs and the technologies, because a lot of people try and force people down a single rabbit hole rather than offering them choice and flexibility. But because different things suit different people in different locations at different times, and convenience should be what we're focusing on rather than just what we want as a business. So, the man from Skechers talked about customer journey. Providing the best customer journey in the most sensible way is always going to win.
Yeah. So I'd love to go back to where we started with these two. It's like with you at Visa thinking about the enrollment process versus the transaction processes.
Yeah, no, absolutely. That's a bit of a challenge, really. So biometric authentication is fantastic for payment authentication, higher acceptance rates and lower fraud, love it. But it does have the fundamental challenge that you have to, exactly like you're saying, Kyle, you have to onboard the user so you know that's the right person that's authenticating. Yeah. And on the other hand, you need to have enough kind of relying parties accepting the authentication solution and the identity solution as well. So you have this two-sided model that we all know from the credit card industry, right? And at the same time, you have to make it secure and user experience fantastic so that the consumers are willing to accept it. And that's kind of the challenge that we have in all markets. And I think when we look at the markets for mature EID schemes, they have managed to crack that through good collaboration in the market. Private and public sectors work together. You got the banks together. You got enough value for the consumers and enough security as well for the consumers.
I'd love to open it up to questions from the audience.
I think there's one there.
Hi there, it's Lee Suka from Cinch. I'd like to bring us back to kind of real-world identity management schemes. So I took a leap of faith. I downloaded a digital wallet. I onboarded my UK driving licence as a verified credential, went through facial recognition, and then I had the now what moment. Firstly, I couldn't use it anywhere, But then I did the mistake of reading the terms and conditions. It said, as a user, I knew the fundamental weaknesses of cryptography, and therefore the company offering this warrant offered no warranty, and if there were any breaches, it was all my responsibility as the end user. So the question is, what does that say about the state of digital identity, and how do we overcome these issues going forward?
Now I want to know what wallet it was.
It wouldn't be fair for me to say that openly. I'll show you later.
Just to sort of, specifically at the moment, and this is a UK-focused thing, so apologies for an international audience, but it's kind of relevant. There's digital identity trust framework process that's ongoing, and as part of the sandbox trial I referred to earlier, is looking at other forms of digital identity, specifically to prove age, which is very relevant at retail in a self-serve checkout context. So the applications are yet to be extended because technically, apart from FinGo and Manchester City Council, other forms of digital identity are not accepted for proof of age. You still have to have a document with a holographic image on it. So I think there's the user liability trade-off, as you referred to, and then there's the applicability of it in market with governments buying into it. So, there's a big move with, they're not represented here, but a few of the companies have age estimation technology, which is not relying on a database, it's relying on their algorithm to give, is it 95% likely that you are over 18 thereof, I can serve you a particular group of products. So it's coming, but the legislation is so far behind that utility is not enabled until the governments get with it and accept it. So there are my kind of learnings from that. That trial completes in June, and there'll be UK legislation possibly 2023 around age prohibited goods. So we've not yet jumped over into the kind of real utilities other than kind of corporate entrance and access and some banking applications. There will be a moment in time when more and more services or those forms of digital identity, particularly provided on a smartphone through a QR, are accepted. But the utility relies on on the regulatory framework.
I can just add a few comments to that. I think that's kind of a recipe for disaster, unfortunately, the kind of experience. And what they've done in the markets where digital identity schemes have flourished is that they have given assurances to the consumers about their limitations on their liability. It's kind of gross negligence almost. And there is what you mentioned as well, there's a trust framework in place that talks about exactly the process, how to do the encryption, certification required, so that in the case when there is an issue, you can prove that we did it to the best of the standard that was given. So then there is no liability. The burden of proof is shifted basically. And at the same time, the other problem that you mentioned is about you need to have relying parties. And that's about where the collaboration in the market is coming in within a framework of trust, that you can have compelling use cases for the consumers. It's really to be or not to be. So I think we have some way to go, but I think the markets that have managed have shown that this is possible. But at least it was an identity wallet. It's a good beginning. Great user experience.
I think there's also something to think about there, because not all biometrics are the same and not all biometrics are equal. And we've come across instances where some companies, their false acceptance and false rejection rates are so low, it's almost ridiculous that it's being trusted. And I think that's where the relying parties need to agree, or the government needs to put in some legislation that says that this is the acceptable level across the world or even just across the country, and actually things that are below that aren't acceptable and shouldn't be used to test and try these things.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. There's also a lot, if you look at the different types of transaction, there are many actually incredibly inefficient transactions out there, with it, both in terms of documentation or whatever, but also levels of fraud. So there's a huge, the stop point is, how can new forms of digital identity solve real world problems without compromising user identity? And that, I think, is the more you prove the benefits of it, the more the people will kind of understand it and embrace it.
And sort of building on your comment about what do I do with it next? It really depends on the context, right? So one of the projects that I know that's rolling out in the next year in the United States is the brand for it's called TruAge, TRUAGE, and it's being rolled out by the convenience store, the National Association of Convenience Stores, conveniently NACS, rhymes with snacks that you buy at convenience stores, and they are implementing a system where folks enroll themselves once using kind of matching between their physical document and their face, and then they go and get a packet of one-time use tokens with their photo and their over 21 status that they can then use to go buy age-restricted goods in the US. And so that is hopefully that wallet, the folks who built that wallet are able to provide their the user base, which is hundreds of millions of people shop at a convenience store every month in the United States, will be
Sounds
using
like
this
a
technology.
clunky journey with tokens and sign-ups when you can just scan your finger.
Get rid of it.
Well, but that, like these are the issues in the real world of adoption of the tools, right?
Yeah.
And
But the great thing about that example is actually the use case.
yeah.
It's compelling for the consumer. At least I can buy, alcohol. I can prove that I'm more than 21 in a good way.
Yeah,
So it's
exactly.
enough.
Hi, this is Andrew Budd. Just to pick up on what Lee said, in my presentation this morning, I said that regulation needed to be fit for purpose. And the question, for example, of who is in a verifiable credentials model, who is the data controller and therefore responsible for managing data breaches is, and I may be slow about this, a bit opaque and unclear. So one of the challenges we're going to have with verifiable credentials is how that model maps onto existing legislation, which includes liabilities for breach. It's one of the challenges we're going to have. The other question I wanted to ask, though, was that Andy and Simon, you are offering the market a non-facial biometric, and one of the challenges that all non-facial biometrics have is the process of binding to the actual physical human being, given that photo IDs only have photographs and not fingers or palms or eyes or fingerprints or whatever. How do you accomplish that binding in practice so that authentications can always be bound back to a real physical living human being, an identifiable human being?
I don't mind. I can go first, and you'll back me up. Okay. So for us, actually, we have to do what we described to bind somebody some form of assisted enrolment. So we would need someone to come to a location with the correct documentation and the correct information. And then with that, we will use that as the method to then take and capture their data. Now, we can do things like looking for duplicates. We can do other things if the same person or similar turn up. But actually, some of the challenges are, with twins and other people, we need to check that as much as possible that we only have one example and one person with those attributes. And that we believe we can do. And the clever guys, Ray and Rob can talk about that in a little bit more detail if anybody wants to ask them more complicated questions.
Yes, I mean, similar. That point of linking the vein template to the individual is a key step in the enrolment process. We've evolved and developed our onboarding process to address that challenge. And any individual can remove a template at any point, add different ones, so they remain in control at all times. So they're bound for as long as they want to be bound, as long as they're running the application or as long as they want the services.
Excellent. Thank you so much.
And I'm here for another questions from our audience online. First, actually, it's the comment and a question from Mabel Cueto from Spain. The comment is, thank you, excellent panel. So I share praises to everybody. Well done. Two interesting questions. First, do you think that maybe if we focus on digital identity as a new and prioritized identification, could that put out of the game some of the countries and minorities, like some kind of discriminations? Interestingly, we at MEF last year, we looked at the people with disabilities, and how they are challenged by digitalization. The year before, through our analysis and study, we looked at older women specifically that globally do not have access to digitalization. And we're looking at speed becoming in Italy when a must have even in some other countries. So interesting question, fits perfectly what we're asking. It comes with a second part. I say, well, plus IA reading and scanning of women, person of color faces is that introducing potentially some bias.
Right.
So 2 questions. I'll leave you to decide who's going to take that.
I'll tackle the first one, or the second one first, which is there has been historically bias in facial recognition technologies, but NIST, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technology in the United States, that has put significant work into improving its testing of algorithms specifically for facial recognition and has basically eliminated bias. So if you are using facial recognition algorithms that are tested by NIST in the latest standards that they have, they aren't biased. So this is kind of this myth that keeps going and doesn't die because it was biased and the industry responded and it isn't biased now.
I mean, another specific use case I referred to earlier in Australia in remote communities, we're managing a supervised onboarding process to assist people through that journey. And from an exclusion point of view, they're not required to have a device or code or even a existing bank account to enable them to prove their identity and pay. And obviously with an internal vein pattern, those ethnicity issues don't crop up. But.
Yeah, I think that's true. And then I'll touch on the first one, which is it's totally an issue. And I think, one way, you didn't use these words, but one way to describe what you're doing is you're basically creating a cloud wallet that is accessed via the biometric and then takes action on behalf of the individual. And there's a project going on with Kiva in Sierra Leone where they're creating cloud wallets basically for everyone in the country. And those are accessible via the banking system where you show up and you present a biometric and it opens your cloud wallet. You do your interaction in the bank, you leave the bank, it closes the cloud wallet. And so they're focused on empowering people who may not have any devices at all, still having a digital identity and being able to use it in particular contexts. Do you have thoughts on this issue of inclusion and how it's addressed in these emerging technologies?
To be honest, I mean, it's a very important challenge, the digital divide, digital literacy, as well as having access to the technology, absolutely. And especially when digital identity is becoming such a core pillar of a efficient society, so to speak. I can only agree, basically. Yeah. And yes, this is an issue.
Yeah.
It needs to be solved.
And I think, too, if we also look at the adoption curve of mobile devices, it's one of the fastest ever adoption curves of any technology. So it sort of needs to be seen in the context of earlier waves of technologies that probably excluded more people for longer, like the telephone, for example, in its original wireline form.
I think it's also worth considering the notion of different alternatives. So you don't have to have a singular solution that everyone in a population must use in all cases.
Yeah.
You're going to be in different socioeconomic circumstances, and you should be able to access easier to use forms of transaction, which may be biometric or whatever. So I don't think there's the wrong way to do it is to impose something from on high and insist there's one way to transact, but where you can support groups with different forms of transaction, there needs to be the flexibility to enable that.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, thank you so much.
Good, thank you.
Thank you.